This is Movietone. Lionel Gamlin reporting. First, typical scenes of airborne troops and paratroops making their final preparations before the attack. Scenes taken a few hours before General Eisenhower's communique number 1 told us that the second front had opened. As we watch these men, we are reminded of those first raids and attacks on occupied Europe, of Commando's exploits in Norway and France, of the reconnaissance in force at Dieppe, of all the lessons learnt and the blood shed in learning them. It is well to pay tribute to the work that has made the present great assault possible. On D-Day, the airborne troops were armed with all the latest weapons, with rations for 2 days and a little French money. But best of all, they went armed with the spirit of victory. And already the brilliant success of their work in the opening phase of the battle is well known. The embarkation of troops, men who were to be the first to land on the beaches while the airborne troops would be fighting further inland. And like the airborne troops, they were allies with a common purpose, the liberation of Europe. Men of the United Nations, with United Kingdom, American and Canadian troops predominating. Never before had such a vast number of ships been assembled. We shall see only a fraction of the Great Armada. Never before had such a vast three-dimensional task confronted the fighting services of Allied nations. 3 of the leaders seen after a final conference. The Supreme Commander with Admiral Ramsay, on whom a tremendous responsibility lay at this moment. And about to strike once more at his old enemy Rommel, whom he had hitherto always defeated, General Montgomery. Such were the last-minute scenes, and then the Armada was at sea. Some faint idea of the size of the undertaking can be obtained from these pictures of aircraft and gliders at their assembly points the moment before the takeoff. Just as the ships and the landing craft almost filled the channel, so Allied aircraft filled great spaces of the sky. The Allied airborne divisions, trained to the last degree for this very moment, were off. After a 24-hour postponement, the great force was on its way. Airmen and airborne troops, looking down, saw the multitude of ships, craft of almost every kind, crossing over to France. Comrades in arms, all of them, but what a vast difference in the roles they had to play. At sea, minesweepers were the pathfinders. More than that, they were the path makers, sweeping the channels through which the Armada had to sail. And this is the actual offshore scene at the opening of the battle for the beaches. Pictures by Jack Ramsden of Movietone, who was aboard a British destroyer on the left flank of the Eastern Task Force. Landing craft and warships blasting the shore defences, coastal batteries reply. This picture was taken about 1.5 miles from the shore between Le Havre and Cherbourg. Then the troops landed. These shots are by Sergeant O'Neill, who went ashore with men from the United Kingdom. They tell their own story, I think. The story of how, 4 years after Dunkirk, 4 years after Hitler thought it was all over by the shouting, Britain came back. Years the Germans had in which to make their stolen fortress impregnable. And even if some of their boasting had been bluff, it would be absurd to suppose that they had not taken into account the likelihood of landings here. But in spite of all their defences and fortifications, Britain came back. Sergeant O'Neill went on shooting these pictures on one of the beaches until he was wounded in the arm. Casualties during the landings, we've been told, were less than had been expected. Men who were wounded received first aid on the beaches themselves, and many were swiftly evacuated. For some of the boys, it was a case of getting hit right at the beginning of the battle for the beaches, and then home again to recover. They've played their part, and a great one, in the opening of the second front. Now they are in good hands. All this time, of course, troops had continued to pour into France following the brilliant success of the Allied landings. Here are more Americans on their way in. Fierce fighting lay ahead of them beyond the beaches. Rommel would undoubtedly counterattack. But the first phase, the securing of a foothold in France, was an Allied victory of the first magnitude. And one of the greatest factors in winning it was Allied mastery of the air. Air cover throughout the operation was magnificent, as it continues to be. Over the beaches themselves and far inland, Allied airmen have been flying thousands of sorties by day and night, protecting Allied forces, bombing and strafing the enemy, smashing his communications. Magnificent work has also been done by Allied warships, which have been dealing with attacks by German E-boats and other craft, as well as pounding German shore defences and silencing battery after battery. In fact, a combined operation on the greatest scale ever carried out. The last scene is the scene on a beach taken by Sergeant Grant of the Canadian Army Film Unit. Canadians had formed the bulk of that reconnaissance in force at Dieppe. Now Canadians were back in France again. Theirs was a defensive role when first they came to Britain. How different now. Storming into Nazi-occupied France, securing the bridgehead and advancing inland. Already prisoners were being taken, and already Frenchmen were celebrating their freedom. A French civilian with an American flag is still a bit dazed by the battle and the bombardment. His treatment of a Boche helmet is certainly expressive. The little village of Bernier, just a small seaside place, had been the scene of a grim battle, but the Hun had been driven out or killed or captured, and on the beach the two-way traffic continued, troops and vehicles landing, German prisoners departing. After 4 years, freedom had returned to a strip of French coast. On the map, a small beginning perhaps, but by every standard of human endeavour, a superb achievement and an outstanding success. Godspeed all those who are fighting now to expand that freedom far and wide across the continent of Europe.